I hope you enjoy the speech I have to talk to you about tonight. I say it's a great honor for me to be here because I've been coming to Griffith since I was like about that high, and to be here speaking at Griffith is just an amazing thing for me. So thank you all for having me here this evening. And as I could talk about the X-15 for hours, so I have to keep pretty much to my script or we'll be here all night long. So, as I say, my name is Michelle Evans. I'm here to tell you the story of the most amazing experimental rocket plane that ever took to the skies, but more importantly, to introduce you to the people who made it all happen. This is the X-15 rocket plane and the men who flew the first wings into space. Let me start with a short excerpt from the book. This is actually the opening of chapter 5. Eons of hot, dry sun baked the ancient lake bottom to near asphalt hardness, the color bleached to a dirty white. Close up, the surface was crisscrossed with fissures, giving it the look of dragon scales. Seasonal rain repeatedly scoured the top layer smooth. Roughly circular, the dry lake was more than 5 miles across, a perfect oasis of level ground among the scattered hills surrounding the area. Southeast of the silver boom town from the early 1900s of Tonopah, Nevada, the lake was given the inauspicious name of Mud. No vegetation marred the pristine surface. Maybe an occasional lizard, snake, jackrabbit, or coyote might dart across the outer edges, but there was little reason for any living thing to trek across the vastness of the silent interior. All these inhospitable qualities were perfect for one special purpose. On the morning of 9 November 1962, that purpose was fulfilled. As the quiet was shattered by a sonic boom, overhead, several specks came into view, one of them black. This one quickly grew in size until it slammed down onto the lake bed. The X-15 with pilot Jack McKay at the controls had not achieved full thrust after launch, so he needed a place to land. Mud Dry Lake was directly to the east of his flight track. He turned and made for the ground. As he neared touchdown, McKay set the flaps, but they did not respond. His landing was going to be very fast. The rear skid slapped down, followed quickly by the nose gear. Bouncing slightly, the left rear skid failed under the strain. A chain reaction began as the now crippled aircraft went out of control. With the skid gone and thus no support on that side, the left wing and rear stabilizer scraped along the ground, soon ripping the stabilizer from its mount, taking the landing skid with it. The wing continued to slide, turning the aircraft before the right wing suddenly caught, flipping X-15 number 2 onto its back. As the accident unfolded for McKay, the beginning of the flip As the accident unfolded for McKay, time slowed as adrenaline kicked in, heightening his test pilot reflexes. Jack sensed the beginning of the flip, instinctively reaching for the canopy jettison switch. He knew if the aircraft went over, he would be trapped inside if it remained in place. The aircraft came to a rest on its back as McKay had feared. With the canopy gone, the weight of the aircraft transferred to Jack's helmet, compressing his neck. Quickly, the twin-bladed H-21 helicopter on standby nearby moved in and used its downwash to keep the area clear of fumes from the toxic fuels aboard the stricken rocket plane. Now, it took 9 years to go from Mach 1 through Mach 2 and all the way to Mach 3. The last of these cost the life of pilot Mel Apt. Gathering speed was a very dangerous business. Yet a winged rocket ship which could double these records in just a few short years went into development, the X-15 rocket plane. Scott Crossfield left the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics for North American Aviation to help design, build, and fly the X-15. Scott is here, right there, with the chief pilot for NASA, who is Joe Walker, who took over from Scott Crossfield, and Ivan Kinchlow, who was the chief pilot for the Air Force. Construction at the North American facility was done down at the LAX facility right by Los Angeles International Airport. It's right there at Aviation and Imperial Highway, which is now unfortunately long gone. As you can see here, it was kept from the prying eyes of even other people who were employees of the facility there at North American. So they had a fence up there so nobody could see it. Until on 15 October 1958, just 2 weeks after NASA was formed out of what was the NACA, the X-15 was unveiled to the public. Vice President Richard Nixon was there and served as the head VIP, and he said that day, "The X-15 is most exciting because of the fact that it is designed to carry man into space for the first time. It is an integral part of an orderly and reasoned space program. These pilots are men to be envied, for theirs will be the ultimate goal toward which men's dreams have stretched for centuries, since the first medicine man gazed into the heavens and sought from them their secrets. It is useless for me to cite their bravery. We can only envy them for the opportunity which is theirs." Now, they prepared for months for the first flight, but problems kept the X-15 in the hangar or attached to the B-52 mothership. Seen here, you can see the lift that would help bring it up to the wing of the B-52. I love the fog here on this one. And another integral part of the X-15 was the Mc2 Pressure Suit, seen here worn by Scott Crossfield. It came from the David Clark Company that had previously specialized in women's undergarments. Crossfield once wrote, "The structural loads imposed on a girdle, as we all know, can be tremendous. And a machine that can build a good one automatically is an amazing engineering accomplishment." With his ingenious machine, Clark had all but cornered the important expanding girdle market. Braving new frontiers, Clark moved into manufacture of brassieres, which, considering those loads, was even more awesome. And this gave David Clark Company the proper foundation to build America's first spacesuits. The cockpit was a very, very tight fit, as you can see here in this extreme fisheye view inside. That's Scott Crossfield sitting inside. And on Monday, 8 June 1959, finally, the X-15 achieved its first flight, dropping from the B-52's wing at 8:38 a.m. Scotty expertly glided the unpowered X-15 toward the Rogers Dry Lake bed at Edwards Air Force Base, which is up in California's Mojave Desert. As he neared landing, Scotty experienced a near-disastrous pilot-induced oscillation. He expertly touched down at the bottom of one of these oscillations, and the first flight was a success. Scotty had microphones in his face before he could leave the cockpit. At the time, everyone thought the X-15 would be the craft that would put the first man into space. The second X-15 soon joined the fleet, making the first powered flight on 17 September 1959. Rocket engine development was behind schedule, so the XLR-11 rockets were installed. These were the same rocket engines which had powered Chuck Yeager and the X-1 past Mach 1 in 1947. The LR-11s worked perfectly. Touchdown. Now, the third powered flight didn't go quite as well, as you can see here. There was a fire in the engine compartment, and he was unable to jettison any fuel and had to land almost immediately at Rosemont Dry Lake, right next door to Edwards. And because of this being overweight, as soon as he touched down, the aircraft literally broke its back. But number one was still there to continue flight testing while number two underwent repairs. And while the initial flight tests continued, the third X-15 was being prepared with the 60,000-pound thrust XLR-99 rocket engine. I'll tell you a little bit more about the differences between the 11 and the 99 later. At the propulsion system test facility, they could test fire two X-15s. Now, note up here in the corner, way up there, a little red and white Bonanza. That was Scott Crossfield's aircraft. And he would fly that back and forth from his home near LAX to Edwards to do the testing. Scott's daughter Sally told me, in the X-15 days he started flying his Bonanza to and from Edwards because we had moved from Lancaster to Los Angeles. And it was the only way that he could get any home time. You know, it's about a 3-hour drive. The powers that be didn't like him flying his personal airplane because they thought it was too dangerous. How's that for ironic, she said. Now this is what a successful LR-99 rocket engine firing should look like in that test stand. But on 8 June 1960, it didn't go quite as planned. A valve, a little tiny piece, stuck, causing a fuel explosion, which literally blew the X-15 in half. Scotty was sitting in the cockpit in the forward section, and that section flew forward over 25 feet. We heard that he experienced probably a momentary 100 Gs. Luckily, as I say, it was momentarily. He actually got detached retinas from that. But he did not suffer any other major injuries. After being hosed down by the firemen, Scotty famously said that the headline that day should read, "Aircraft blows up, pilot wets pants." Now, this is one of the only photos showing the first 4 X-15 pilots. You can see we have Forrest Peterson from the Navy, Bob White from the Air Force, Joe Walker from NASA, and Scott Crossfield from North American Aviation. The Navy often got left out, unfortunately. As you can see in this other publicity photo, which only has White, Crossfield, and Walker. And I'll talk a little bit more about Peterson and the Navy in a moment too. But finally, Scotty had to leave. Here, Bob White symbolically takes the keys from Scott while Neil Armstrong of NASA looks on. They were really anxious to get going. Scotty wanted to fly all the flights on the X-15, and it's like, nope, nope, time to go, bye-bye. Now, a typical mission profile for an X-15. The X-15 was the first experimental aircraft to ever leave the local area of Edwards Air Force Base. It required a 400-mile-long corridor known as the High Range. As you see, it stretched from Edwards here all the way up toward Wendover, Nevada. They never actually launched all the way at Wendover. And it had 2 spots, Ely and Beatty in Nevada, to help guide the flight. I say Ely is just up there in the corner. Beatty is just east of Death Valley. And this is Ely. Oh, I'm sorry. Whoops. There we go. Sorry. As I say, Ely here in the northeast corner of Nevada was 9,300 miles or 9,300 feet up in the mountains. And as you can see, it can just get a little bit cold at times up there. I actually went up to Ely one time myself in mid-June and could not make it all the way up. It was still under snow there. It was totally barriered up there. Now here's a group shot of the first batch of X-15 pilots, the primary and backup pilots. Had Bob Rushworth from the Air Force. He was backup to Bob White over on this end. Jack McKay was one of the pilots for NASA. Joe Walker was the primary NASA pilot with Neil Armstrong and Jack McKay both behind him. And in the middle, Forrest Peterson from the Navy. He was the only pilot for the Navy. Now, first up after Scotty finally left was Joe Walker. As you can see here, he was sort of a relaxed country boy from Pennsylvania. He's having a donut before his flight. And here he is stepping out of the suiting van and heading toward the X-15 for his flight, and dropping away on the very first NASA flight of the program on 25 March 1960. Notice that NASA wasted no time in emblazoning their bright yellow logo on the plane's tail. I want to make sure everybody knew where this plane was coming from. And compare the servicing requirements for an X-15 after landing to an entire naval flotilla that was required for the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo flights. And Joe Walker took the X-15 literally to new heights for manned aircraft. On 22 August 1963, Walker topped out the X-15 program at 354,200 feet. That is 67.1 miles. With no air, attitude control jets were required to keep the rocket plane properly oriented, as you see here in this artwork, before a human-controlled re-entry. And here's the curvature of the Earth as seen by the pilots of the X-15. Joe's eloquent perspective on this flight, he said, "The overhead aspect is just like one of those dark velvet photographer's cloths as far as the sky's appearance, but there weren't any specks of light peeking through that I could pick out." He remarked live on the radio, "By gosh, it's dark up here today." Quite a different view. What a beautiful day this is. It can probably be said that of the 12 X-15 pilots, Joe enjoyed the ride more than anyone else. He said, "You know, you've got a long time to where you find yourself having done your looking around and figuring, well, if I'd had better sense, I would have looked around more." Joe completed his stint on the X-15 and left to become NASA's chief pilot on the XB-70A bomber. On 8 June 1966, Walker was flying an F-104 chase plane as part of a 5-aircraft formation centered on that B-70. The F-104 slid in tight for photographs and was caught in the wingtip vortex and flipped over the top of the B-70. A frantic call of "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday" went out over the air. Walker was killed instantly as the F-104 rolled across the top of the bomber. The B-70 was also crippled and went down minutes later, killing co-pilot Carl Cross. But B-70 pilot Al White, who had been Crossfield's backup on the X-15, did survive, although he had severe injuries. Now, the prime pilot for the Air Force was Bob White, seen here in the cockpit with Joe Walker while he was still flying the program. These were also the two primary X-15 record setters. Here you can see White is preparing for a drop in a very short 10-minute rocket flight that was to come. You can see here in the cockpit the white helmet. He's got his head down, probably checking his instruments or his checklist, just getting ready for drop there. Bob White was the first man to surpass 3 Mach numbers. We had Mach 1 from Chuck Yeager, Mach 2 was Scott Crossfield, Mach 3 was Mel Apt, and it killed him. Bob White went out and hit Mach 4, 5, and 6. He told me, "You know, I didn't realize until afterward that I was the first Mach 4, 5, and 6. Now, if some NASA guy had said, 'Hey, wait a minute, we want Joe Walker to break one of these here too,' I'm not sure what would have happened." The Air Force really liked breaking their records. White was very proud of his skills on the X-15, so much so that he bet a martini that he could set the rocket plane down within 1,000 feet of the planned touchdown point. Now remember, this is on a dry lake bed where you could touch down any direction, anywhere within miles. But he said, "I can do this within 1,000 feet of this touchdown point." And this is also not bad when you consider he's gliding back from suborbital space. He won his bet on nearly every one of his 16 flights. And here the B-52 provides a salute after another successful flight, after White had made a record flight to 314,000 feet. And after achieving that height on 17 July 1962, White had to get out quick and head for Washington because he was scheduled to receive the Collier Trophy with his fellow pilots Crossfield, Walker, and Peterson. You can see here they're receiving the trophy from President John F. Kennedy, who said that day, "We are very proud of these 4 young men who are among the finest we have, who took a manned aircraft into space yesterday to over 300,000 feet and 4,000 miles per hour. So we are very proud to have you here, not only for what they have done in space, but also because they represent the kind of Americans whom we want this country to be identified with. We hope that their example will encourage others to do something that requires reaching beyond what we now know and what we now do." I promised to come back to this briefly here, the LR-11 versus the LR-99. You can see the LR-11, the little thing over here. It actually took 2 of these, one stacked on top of the other, mounted in the back of the X-15 to give 16,000 pounds of thrust. That's 16,000. The LR-99, this one little chamber here, provided 60,000 pounds of thrust and an engine less than 6 feet long. It was an amazing engine. They actually have some of these still in storage. If somebody wants to pull one of these out and make their own rocket plane, go right ahead, yes. Here's what the twin LR-99s would look like firing on the test stand. So you can see the upper and lower engines there. And the X-15 under power with the twin LR-11s. The maximum speed achieved was Mach 3.5, half that envisioned for the LR-99, but it did push the X-15, as I say, to Mach 3.5. This was the very first time that anybody had flown Mach 3 and survived. And here's a very impressive view of the single-chamber LR-99 firing on the test stand and what it looked like installed in the X-15 ready for flight. This is the business end of the X-15 loaded on the wing of the B-52. Now, Forrest Peterson was the only U.S. Navy X-15 pilot. While serving on the X-15, he was up for promotion. But to get in the Navy, to get that promotion in the Navy, required that he have sea duty, which is sort of hard to come by while you're assigned to a base, when you're up at Edwards in the desert. But there was a way found around it, as you can with any good government thing. You can find a good way around it. So they assigned him to a naval squadron just north of Edwards at the Naval Ordnance Test Station, also known as Knott's, not the one next to Disneyland. Although China Lake was just as landlocked as Rogers Dry Lake, the Navy still considered it as sea duty. Peterson said, all they did was assign me to that squadron up at China Lake. I stayed at the same office at Edwards where I'd always been. After a year, I'd accumulated the sea duty, so they promoted me to commander. On 10 January 1962, Peterson made his last flight in the X-15, which also turned out to be the very first emergency landing outside of the Edwards Air Force Base area. This is also after a landing up at Mud Lake, which I talked about briefly at the very beginning, but not that same flight. Again, this is up near Tonopah, Nevada, which is just about central, right, almost the dead center of Nevada, very close to that. And so the X-15, after the landing, had to be picked up and trucked back to Edwards. And of course, you know, if you're on a long trip home, you got to stop to get some gas and a snack. I should throw it in here. I actually have a photograph very similar to this. I went up for the rollout of the Discovery Space Shuttle, and they had to take it from the Palmdale plant up to Edwards on back roads. And I have a picture of the Discovery Space Shuttle sitting out in front of the 7-Eleven. So, Now, Peterson had to leave the X-15 to resume his naval career, which included commanding the aircraft carrier, the USS Enterprise. Captain Kirk would be proud. And here are the next two pilots in line, Bob Rushworth, who is behind the aircraft, and Jack McKay sitting in the aircraft. And they're talking with newsman Walter Cronkite, or some people like to call him Walter Concrete. He was doing an interview for them, with them for the 20th Century, his old TV show. Now, strapped to the mothership's wing, McKay heads for launch altitude. The morning of 9 November 1962, and things didn't go quite so well as I read to you at the beginning. This is that excerpt that I read to you. This is what the aftermath of that crash looked like. The shadow of the H-21 is seen hovering above the crippled and upside-down X-15 number 2. McKay here is already on his way to the hospital. Operations engineer Bill Albrecht told me Jack McKay saved his own life. As soon as he saw it was going to tumble over, he jettisoned the canopy. He was smart enough to think, if I go over and I'm not breathing air, because he was strapped in his pressure suit, of course, by the time they get to try to rescue me, I'll be dead. Now you can see the massive damage to the X-15. Who wouldn't expect this to be a complete and total loss? It's amazing that McKay survived. Bill Albrecht told me, my first view of it was from the window of a C-47 Gooneyberg, which took a bunch of us up to Mud Lake. When I saw that thing upside down, I said, well, that's the end of that airplane. But a steel airplane is something else. It's tough stuff. This thing is literally made out of steel, not aluminum like you might think. It was Inconel X steel. Yes. This was a very heavy aircraft. Yes. Although severely injured, McKay returned to the program, and he accomplished 22 more X-15 research flights. He was the second most flights of any pilot on the X-15 program. Although he also experienced 2 more emergency landings before finally leaving the program in September 1966. And this, as you can see, the aircraft's in a little better shape in this case, but he rolled off the edge of Delamar Dry Lake. And I have to point out one thing here. See this little thing sticking up right there? Looks like somebody stuck a hanger in for a radio antenna on an old car. That's actually a piece of the B-52 pylon that pulled out when he dropped away. Had nothing to do with the accident, but he took a piece of the B-52 with him. I always thought that was a pretty bizarre one to see. Now, McKay was a family man. He had 8 children, seen here with 2 of them at Red Rock Canyon. In the end, the injuries shortened his life. He died in 1975. Sherry, who's the oldest, she's here with her brother, she told me most of the time when there's an accident with a test pilot, they are killed outright. They aren't hanging around in the halls at Edwards as a reminder of what might happen. I think my father felt more alienated from everyone and everything. He was in such a tremendous amount of pain. Now, Bob Rushworth was up next and became the most successful X-15 pilot of the 12, accomplishing 34 flights in less than 6 years. Now, Paul Bickle was the head of the X-15 program, and he related that Bob White had once said of Rushworth, "He's not motivated enough. We asked if he wanted to get on the X-15 program, and he said he had to think about it for a week." As you can see from the photo here, the F-104 and the silver aircraft there and the X-15 were very similar in shape and size. So the F-104 was the perfect way for X-15 pilots to practice their landings. And this is something that Rushworth and the other pilots did hundreds of times during the program. That's why people like Bob White were able to get their martini after every touchdown. After the McKay accident in 1962, you remember that aircraft that was a mangled mess? They rebuilt it. This is what it looks like. This is the X-15A2. They lengthened the fuselage, they added these wing tanks to it. They were actually shooting for the possibility of Mach 8 with this aircraft. You also see they changed the windows. They're elliptical instead of rectangular now. And with the external tanks in place, this updated version could really push the edge of what the X-15 could do. They originally were looking for Mach 6. As I say, with these external tanks, they were hoping for maybe Mach 8. Like the solid rocket boosters on the space shuttle, the tanks would be jettisoned at Mach 2. On Rushworth's last flight, it was the first with full fuel tanks. El Cheapo transducers, as flight planner Johnny Armstrong told me, misread the fuel flow. The tanks were erroneously jettisoned. They said the tanks were not feeding, and they were feeding just fine. Another emergency landing back into Mud Lake. That was a popular spot up there. Here's another group shot here, some later pilots, some of the earlier and later pilots. Jack McKay here, who we talked about. This is after his accident. His spine was actually compressed 3/4 of an inch by that accident. Joe Walker, again, who you've seen before. One of the later pilots, Milt Thompson. And we have Bob Rushworth again, and Joe Engle, who I'm very proud to say is the person who wrote the foreword for my book. And Joe Engle and another pilot you haven't met yet here, Bill Dana, are actually the only 2 surviving X-15 pilots out of the 12 still with us today. And not shown there was Neil Armstrong, who became the 7th X-15 pilot. Now, tell me, everybody, does this not look like some guy took his 12-year-old son out here and set him down? This is like, take your kid to work day or something. He looks like a little kid, I tell you. He always looked so much younger than his age. He was a great guy. And here's Neil talking with a couple of X-15 engineers. And again, leaving the suiting van like we saw with Joe Walker earlier and heading out toward the rocket plane. And now he's finally ready for drop. Roger Barnicky, who was in the life support systems, he worked on that Mc2 Pressure Suit, said, I watched them get ready for flight and come back and just have the biggest grin on their faces. They were doing something they loved, and it really showed how much they enjoyed flying. That was their life. There wasn't one of them that didn't give me that impression. But what if something screwed up in the airplane that was the pilot's fault? Well, then they were kind of quiet, but they didn't hide things. And Neil screwed up on several occasions, such as the flight where he skipped back up out of the atmosphere in the X-15, almost landing at LAX, which is one of the stories in the book. Or got stuck on a wet lake bed, another story you can read about in the book, or by not judging his altitude correctly and almost crashed his F-104 while checking out a dry lake bed for use during an upcoming X-15 flight. Now this shows the aftermath of that incident. Paul Bickle described this scene to me. Neil realized what he'd done and he firewalled the F-104, but while the engine was picking up speed, the ship kept getting lower and lower. He dragged one of the tip tanks off and dragged the ventral off the tail, which released the arrestor hook back there. For all you Navy pilots, you have the arrestor hook there? Yes. It also tore out one of the hydraulic systems and the radio antenna, which left him without any radio. Only emergency hydraulics and red lights flashing all over the place. That's how close he got to the ground. The gear was literally being shoved back up into the vehicle before he was able to firewall it and get out of there. He knew he had some problems, but he didn't know what. So he'd figure he'd better make a flaps-up landing. Neil came in to the runway at Nellis Air Force Base, which is near Las Vegas. And this hook's hanging out the back. He snagged that arresting chain across the approach end of the runway at 220 knots. Just tore the chain out of the runway. His airplane went down the runway dragging all this junk, blew off the tires. Nellis was tied up for 3 hours getting the thing cleared off. Then Milt Thompson goes up in a two-place F-104B to bring Neil back down, and he overshot the runway, blew his tires off, tied the thing up again. Bill Dana went up, and when he got up there, the aerodrome officer called me and he said, hey, you guys, don't send any more airplanes up here. We'll load all your guys in one of ours and bring them back to you. A disgraceful display all around. After that, Neil left for Houston, and the rest is history. Now, early in Joe Engle's career, he got to serve as a docent during a visit from Vice President Hubert Humphrey to Edwards. Here he is showing off the LR-99 engine. I was the new guy in the program, and Bob Rushworth told me, you're going to go down to the hangar and stand by the X-15. Just stand there. You won't have to say anything. Now, Humphrey came up and he said, well, what have we here? Scared the hell out of me because I didn't know how to talk to a guy like that. But Joe recovered quickly, replying to Humphrey, it's the X-15, sir. The vice president thought a moment, then said, oh, yes, yes. And how many squadrons of these do we have? Ingle wasn't quite sure what to say, but he replied, well, not very many, sir. Humphrey said, well, we need more of these. I'll fix that when I get back to Washington. Ingle went on to fly 3 astronaut qualification flights in the X-15, seeing the Earth from more than 280,000 feet above the southwest, as seen here. This is Las Vegas down at the bottom, up toward Lake Mead area here, which is actually off sort of toward the east of Vegas. But it was a long way up, that's for sure. This is an artist's rendition of what the X-15 might look like coming back from suborbital space. It's one thing I'm very proud of for the book. I have been in contact with a guy named Tommy Eriksson. He lives in Sweden, and he created all the illustrations for the book. There are 8 of these original pieces of artwork within the book, and he did a fantastic job. I gave him the opportunity to depict the X-15 like no photograph could ever capture, and he did a wonderful job. So I want to give a hats off to Tommy for that. Now, many others were also excited about the X-15. Even as astronauts prepared to fly to the moon, here you have Wernher von Braun, the architect of the Apollo program, and he wanted to know what it would be like to fly a winged craft into space. And here we have another aficionado, Miss Edwards, 1962, Wanda Capps, who gets a lift from the X-15. And the cast and crew from the TV show of Star Trek came out to check out the real deal. Right there in the center is Gene Roddenberry. And you see a few of the others, Scotty and DeForest Kelley is back there, yes. Now, the X-15 was often considered as a man's program, but it should never be forgotten that many women worked on it too. They were called computers, and they took all the data that was received and plotted it for the engineers using calculators, paper, and pens. Without the women, the X-15 data meant nothing. And like Neil, Joe left for Houston and was initially assigned as the lunar module pilot for Apollo 17, which was to be the 6th lunar landing. But he got bumped for geologist Harrison Smith. So Joe finally got to fly into space again on 2 missions aboard the space shuttle, STS-2 in 1981 and STS-51I in 1985. Joe's the only astronaut who has ever entered space and earned his astronaut wings prior to going into orbit with his 3 X-15 astronaut qualification flights. And he's from Kansas, in case you can't tell by his... Yeah. And now after getting, Milt Thompson was a man torn between 2 flight test programs. He also got to be NASA's technical advisor on the very first movie ever filmed in space. It says it was filmed in space. They must be true, right? Milt recalled being involved for approximately 3 months on this production. I think they were here on site probably a couple of months, and after that we went down and spent 1 month in Hollywood during the cutting process. I asked him, well, did you have any input as to how to make the film better? Oh yeah, a lot of stuff. It was completely wrong on many things. They really didn't understand airplanes at all. The guy that wrote the script had apparently never been around an airplane. If you haven't seen this movie, it's on Amazon. It's great. You got to watch this. Stars Charles Bronson, who's seen here with the real X-15 pilot Bob White, and his co-star was Mary Tyler Moore in her big screen debut. But the hype didn't end there. There were a couple of scenes. Here's some from Battle in Outer Space. This is a Japanese movie. And this is finally where they got to put those squadrons of X-15s that Hubert Humphrey ordered into service battling aliens. I love these silo-launched X-15s. And the death ray on the nose of the X-15. I never knew they armed it before this. Now, people forget how popular the X-15 was at the time that it flew. It was used to advertise a company's participation in the high-flying program, or just to get your attention by calling your product the Kodak Instamatic X-15. Besides film and advertising were also many books, including the fictional adventures of Mike Mars. Anybody here ever read Mike Mars? Oh, nobody? Oh, Mike Mars is great. He's a favorite. These are young adult books and stuff. I grew up on Mike Mars and Tom Swift and all those, yes. And a really cool X-15 run-around friction toy. I'd love to have this one. I collect a lot of X-15 memorabilia, so I'm always checking eBay for new stuff. And in 2006, the post office even issued 2 X-15 stamps, which were also holograms. So after 14 flights and a chance at Hollywood, Thompson finished his time on the X-15. He told me it was busy on those altitude flights. I really only got the chance to look out the window once, and that was my very last flight. I got up on top after I had everything fairly settled, then looked out the window. Gee, it was a really impressive view. You could see all the way from San Francisco down to Baja, California. That was pretty impressive, you know. It was beautiful up there, but you just have a few seconds to take a look. Now, Milt was the first man to also fly the lifting body type, as seen here behind him, the M2F2. And he had to make a choice between one program and the other. And contrary to what you might think, he actually went to the lifting body program over the X-15. Now, Pete Knight was about to become the fastest man alive. His program was the X-15A2 with the external fuel tanks inherited from Bob Rushworth. That was the rebuilt X-15 number 2 after that crash. Pete made 16 flights on the X-15. One of them is one of the most famous, while the other was one of the most dangerous. The program built up speed, testing out the capabilities using the external tanks. And also a primary purpose of the high-speed flights was to test a scramjet engine, as seen here, attached to the bottom half of the X-15, the bottom tail of the X-15. After years of work, this scramjet never came to fruition and has only recently been tested using unmanned vehicles at hypersonic velocity. So they tested these shapes to see if they were going to work. But before continuing with the A2 program, on a routine flight in aircraft number 1, Pete launched, and soon afterward, all electrical power in the rocket plane died. No one knew where he was, or even if he was alive. He had no radio, no transponder, nothing. Knight told me, I was a little over Mach 4. The airplane was sort of wallowing around. I still had reaction jets, so I maintained some control. At one time, I was up about 70 degrees of bank angle. And I looked down at Mono Lake and I told myself, you better enjoy that view because that's the last one you're going to see. My thoughts were that this is going to hurt regardless of what I did. If I bailed out, I was over Mach 4, and that's the limit on the ejection seat. So I thought, well, I'll stay with it and see what happens, see how long I can control it. Once I lose it, then I'll bail out. As the aircraft went over the top, I started an auxiliary power unit, and that gave me hydraulics to control the re-entry. I didn't have any instruments. There were no lights in the cockpit. As I entered the atmosphere, I turned around and pulled about 6 Gs to go back to mud. I didn't have any flaps. All I had was airspeed and altitude once I went subsonic. Knight landed safely, but it took a while to find him. He was sitting on Mud Lake. They lost contact literally. There's a series of lake beds as you come down the high range. And they say that if something happens at this point in your flight, you turn around and go to this lake bed. If it's from there forward, you go to this lake bed. It happened literally on the 10th of a second of that crossover between one lake bed and another. Everybody thought he went to this lake bed, and he made the decision to go back. So they couldn't find the guy. And once they arrived, Pete was flown back to Edwards, and the X-15 was made ready for another convoy back to base. Now, made to protect the X-15A2 and its pilot at speeds of up to Mach 8, this Martin ablator had the consistency of a pencil eraser, along with the color. But it was oxygen sensitive, meaning that oxygen could soak in, and if something struck the ablative, like somebody's hammer or a wrench or something, it could literally explode. Not to mention, as Knight explained very emphatically to me, it was pink. I wasn't going to fly a pink airplane. So they put a white paint layer on top. They called it a wear layer. And Pete then felt it was safe to come near the X-15 again. And here's North American Aviation's 2 white beauties, the XB-70A bomber and the X-15A2 rocket plane, now nicknamed the White Knight. It was 2:31 in the afternoon of 3 October 1967 when Pete dropped away from the B-52, fully loaded, ablative-covered X-15A2. He leveled off at 102,100 feet and pushed the throttles forward for a speed run. Topped out at Mach 6.70, that's 4,520 miles per hour. Unbeknownst to him, the aircraft was in grave peril as shock waves burned through the X-15 skin. After landing, the damage was clear. They had almost lost the X-15. This aircraft would never fly again. But for surviving that high-speed flight, Knight was awarded the Harmon Trophy by President Lyndon Johnson. Now, Bill Dana was the last of the NASA pilots to come onto the program. And the best way to get used to flying at Mach 6 or 300,000 feet was to sit in the hangar and fly what they called the Iron Bird, the X-15 simulator. Usually you're having a cup of coffee or whatever at the time. A little different than actually being dropped off a B-52. And here you can see the view inside the hangar with all three X-15s lined up. You've got some other aircraft back here. You've got the lifting bodies. This is really a far cry from what that same hangar looks like today. That was a very exciting time. I saw that when I was a kid, and it was amazing. It really was. Now here we have an unexplained Band-Aid on Dana's nose. This is the day prior to his first flight. I don't know, maybe he got into an altercation with that simulator. But by this time in the program, the X-15 carried experiments rather than being the experiment itself. This image shows the X-15 as it has literally never been seen before, working in space with instruments deployed. Solar spectrum missile launch signature detection, high altitude balloon deployment, or Bill's favorite, and I do say this extremely sarcastically, collecting micrometeorite dust. Dana said to me, I remember there was a big meteor shower, and to get out there to Edwards for that early flight, I had to drive to work in the dark. I have never ever seen so many shooting stars in my life. There must have been 1,000 as I came in from Lancaster. And those were the micrometeorites we were going to go up and try to capture. I always thought what a classically dumb idea it was in the first place. What of the possibility of capturing one through the X-15 cockpit rather than the experiment on the wingtip pod out here? Bill stated hopefully, well, I don't suppose it would have hurt us. But Bill survived his high-altitude experiment flights. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the 12th and final X-15 pilot, Michael J. Adams from the United States Air Force. Seen here on his wedding day with his wife Frida. After being accepted as an astronaut in the Manned Orbiting Laboratory program, Mike saw the writing on the wall that they were just never going to fly that program, so he transferred to the X-15, where he flew 6 successful missions until the morning of 15 November 1967, less than 6 weeks after that high-speed flight of Pete Knight. Launching at 10:30 a.m., Mike headed upward into space, topping out at 266,000 feet, earning him a set of astronaut wings. But electrical problems distracted him. At the top of his arc, he misread an instrument and actually turned the X-15 backward along its flight path for re-entry. As the air bit into the rocket plane, the orientation sent Adams into a hypersonic spin, knocking him out. Mike came to long enough to grab the controls, but the aircraft went into a severe up and down porpoising motion. It exceeded the structural limits, breaking the aircraft apart. Near Ridgecrest, the remains of X-15 number 3 crashed into the desert just 4 minutes after launch, 10:34 a.m. Bob White told me, I often felt that sometimes we went too far with these things. When I was participating in the program, your eye was always on the ball. It was very intense. Now you're starting to take this as a routine thing. Boy, that's not routine stuff. That NASA is a different NASA than the one I operated with. After the accident, the X-15 was flown by Knight and Dana 8 more times over the coming year, before finally coming to a close with the final flight on 24 October 1968. The number 1 X-15 was shipped off to the National Air and Space Museum, where it's still at, and the number 2 went to the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, now called the National Museum of the United States Air Force. Here are 7 of the pilots there to celebrate the X-15 at the Smithsonian soon after it arrived. It used to sit on the floor before the new National Air and Space Museum was built. It was literally right underneath the Spirit of St. Louis. The X-15 created 8 new astronauts, 5 from the Air Force and 3 from NASA. Now, the Air Force took care of their own at the time that it happened, but it took until 2005 for NASA to recognize the achievements of Walker, McKay, and Dana. Bill Dana was the only one of those 3 still alive to receive his wings, seen here, flanked by Bob White, Neil Armstrong, and Joe Engle. What could have come next? Maybe a possible delta wing variant, but that disappeared after the Adams accident, since number 3 was the aircraft slated for this program. They were actually cutting metal for the new wings on this delta wing version, and that was canceled in November '67. Or maybe they could have done a scramjet-powered model, a true follow-on to the X-15, something which has never materialized in the 45 years since the program was completed. No manned X-plane may ever again achieve what the X-15 accomplished. No more testing our limits, no new frontiers to achieve. I hope that maybe the story of the X-15 and the people who made it happen may instead inspire a new generation to take flight in a quest for the unknown. The pilots of the X-15 bid you farewell and a good evening.
Michelle, thank you. Thank you so much. That was so enjoyable and informative. Did you all learn something and bring back memories from those X-15 days? We do have time for some questions if you're up for it. So,
how did you first get involved? What inspired you at first to write this book?
I first got involved with the X-15 in a peripheral sort of way when I was a little kid. My dad worked in the aerospace industry. He worked on space stations at Convair, things like that. And he was working for a little company called Sangamo Electric at the time, which they have these data recorders that would record like the telemetry that would come down from the aircraft and spacecraft. And part of his territory was Edwards Air Force Base. And as a 5-year-old kid, he used to take me along on these trips. And so I used to go up there and see the X-15. He'd be off working, and he'd pawn me off on some friend of his and stuff. Here, take care of my kid. And I'd get to go out and watch the X-15, you know, getting prepared for flight, or the astronauts there in the simulator and things like that. So I've been fascinated by the X-15 since I was very, very small. Yes. Yes.
What was the maximum altitude, and the maximum speed was 6.7?
Yes, maximum speed was Mach 6.7, 4,520 miles an hour. The maximum altitude was 354,200 feet, 67.1 miles high. So it was definitely up out of the atmosphere. That was the equivalent altitude of low Earth orbit. Although, again, the altitude and speed flights were separate. They did the altitude flights are usually up in the 200,000 to 300,000 range. The speed flights were usually done right around 100,000 feet. So they'd get up and they'd just push. So the actual altitude flights were probably only about Mach 4. And of course, to get orbital velocity, you need to get up about 17,500 miles an hour. But it was very, very similar in trajectory and speed to like the first couple of Mercury flights, which were suborbital flights also. Yeah.
There's one over here.
There we go.
What's the highest Mach ever reached?
The highest Mach ever reached, well, the X-15 was Mach 6.7. Nobody has broken that record since. However, it depends on how you want to count it. There was an unmanned vehicle, a scramjet that they were trying to fly, that flew out of Australia that did reach Mach 10, but for like literally a split second before it crashed. Minor detail. And the space shuttle which of course is flying back from orbit. As she mentioned earlier, we have Mach 25. Mach 25 is literally the highest speed you can fly within the atmosphere. Once you're up in space, there is no Mach number because you're not in atmosphere at all. But that re-entry, you're hitting Mach 25 and then slowing down as you're coming back into the atmosphere and down to a landing.
In the thermosphere?
Yeah, you're literally going through all the different layers, the thermosphere and every layer from, ground zero all the way into space, yes. Yes.
How much of the Blackbird are we seeing, or how much of this are we seeing in the Blackbird?
Really, there's no crossover between them. They were actually developed at fairly close to the same time. The precursor of the SR-71 Blackbird was the YF-12, and it was under development from the late 1950s, a little after the X-15 went into development. Say the X-15 was flying just about the time that the YF-12 was being developed. The SR-71, I believe, went into service in 1964. The SR-71, the Blackbird, is an aircraft that most people recognize. It only flew Mach 3, so it was half of what the X-15 did. And Kelly Johnson, who was the designer of the Blackbird, was always actually disdainful of things like the X-15 because it's like, well, my SR-71, that's an operational aircraft. We're out there flying all the time. The X-15, it's just up there doing these, flights every once in a while. The X-15 actually accomplished 199 flights over the course of 9 years, so it had a pretty respectable record to it. But no, it was never made to be operational. And so most of what you got out of the X-15 was the experience that made the space shuttle possible more than something like the SR-71. One of the big things that came out of the X-15 was the fact that it proved the viability of a human-controlled re-entry from space to a pinpoint landing. When they proved that could be done, that's what made the space shuttle possible. Early designs for the space shuttle, they actually had jet engines mounted on the thing so that when it got back down low enough, let's just spool up those engines and see if we can start flying around like an airliner. What happens when you're flying back from space and those engines don't start up correctly or whatever? And so they took the data from the X-15. Milt Thompson, one of the X-15 pilots, actually went down to Houston and had a week-long conference with the guys who were working on the original designs of the space shuttle and proved to them you do not need those jet engines. And he was absolutely true. We saved a lot of weight and got a lot more into orbit because of not having to carry that fuel and those engines on there. Could you imagine these engines just plopping out and starting it up and everything else, the weight and everything of that, the mechanics of it? It would have been a disaster. Yes. Yes.
What material did they use on the rigid skin on the X-15?
The primary material was Inconel X steel, which is
The skin itself.
that is the skin of the aircraft was its own heat sink and everything. So it was the outer skin. There were some areas of titanium, which is another thing. Like the SR-71, the primary structure is titanium. Titanium was used on the X-15 in the low heat areas. The X-15 skin got up to 1,350 degrees. So it would routinely get that. You saw the picture of the reentry, how it glowed red. So, and it was literally, it was very much like a stainless steel. It was a variation on stainless steel. And most all of that structure is out of that stainless steel. And, but if you look at the X-15, it's painted black. However, later on, they really didn't need to paint it because the heat sinking going back and forth through reentry and such, it actually turns sort of a blue-black. So if you see the X-15 at the Smithsonian or at the Air Force Museum in Ohio, it's actually really not painted. And in fact, they used to have to paint the decals on there, like the NASA logo and things like that. And after most of the flights, those decals just sort of melted off and they had to repaint them all the time. Yeah. Yes.
Did Scott Crossfield get his astronaut wings, and what are the requirements for astronaut wings in the X-15?
The requirement for astronaut wings, at the time the X-15 flew, the American requirement for astronaut wings was 50 miles. So the X-15 flew under those rules, which is about 262,000 feet approximately. So anything above that, and you qualified for astronaut status. That's why we have 8 astronauts who were qualified on the X-15. Today, they look at it through the FAI, the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, and they say their criteria is 100 kilometers, which equates to about 62 miles. So by that criteria, the only one who would truly qualify would be Joe Walker. He's the only one that made it above 62 miles. But still, considering the time, the qualifications at that time were 50 miles, so we go by the criteria that was in place at that time. An answer about Scott Crossfield, no, he never got anywhere near that. Part of his contract with North American as the contractor pilot, he was required to stay originally below Mach 2 and 100,000 feet. And they basically found the X-15 would not fly at Mach 2. So they needed to expand that and gave him up to Mach 3. But he still kept it below. I think he got to 90,000 feet, was as high as he ever got. And even technically, the flight where he hit Mach 3, and he will absolutely, or at least he did to me and stuff, he insisted, I definitely hit Mach 3 that day. But according to the records, it was Mach 2.97. So they didn't want to give him anything. Because he worked for NASA, actually the NACA, the predecessor to NASA, and left NASA to go to the contractor. And so there was some bad blood, really, between him and NASA and the Air Force. And it's like, no, you chose to go that path, so you're not going to get to break the records. You check out the airplane. You give it back to us, we're going to go out and do the workhorse stuff. And he was very disappointed in that. And literally when he left the X-15, he never looked back. I asked him about stuff when I sat there talking to him that he had no clue about. He did not even know that they had done the expanded X-15 with the external tanks on it. He was so disappointed that he did not get to fly literally every flight that he put it behind him. He really did. Yes.
Does outer space differ at the poles than it does, say, over the equator?
I think there's a little bit of difference in height because of the oblateness of the Earth and stuff, but I can't tell you exactly what the numbers are. I mean, the atmosphere expands and contracts every day as it is, depending on the heat and the output of the sun. And so the solar radiation, it makes these differences. I know on the space shuttle, they consider entry interface, which is what they call the start of reentry, as beginning around 454,000 feet. They're very exact about that. But as I say, the X-15 flew up to 350,000 feet, and it was definitely well outside the atmosphere as far as that goes. There's no way that you had any air working on the wings at that level. But it was also going much slower, about 1/4 the speed of the shuttle coming back. So for the X-15, relatively speaking, the reentry would usually occur somewhere around 220,000 feet or so. So about half the altitude of the space shuttle is what they classified as reentry space. Yes.
Compare the X-15 flight profile to the White Knight and Spaceship Two. Branson.
Oh yes. Virgin Galactic. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, we have Spaceship 1 and Spaceship 2 now. Spaceship 1, we were up there for the flights of Spaceship 1 back in 2004, and there's actually crossover between Spaceship 1 and the X-15. We had people who worked on both programs. And a guy named Bob Hoey used to work on the X-15, and he was hired by Burt Rutan, to work on the Spaceship 1, help develop flight profiles and things like that. And I know on the final flight of Spaceship 1, when they qualified for the X Prize, they hit 371,000 feet, I think it was. They finally broke the altitude record. It took 42 years, but they finally broke the X-15's altitude record. As I say, the speed record has never come close. The speed on Spaceship 1 was only about Mach 3, 3.2, something like that, more like the SR-71 range. And you'll find very similar in speed and altitude for Spaceship Two, which is being developed now. They'll hopefully start flying commercial flights maybe in early 2014. From the looks of it, that's going to happen. But the flight profile is actually very, very similar to the X-15. I think they're going to be trying to get a little higher than the 370, 380. They may even hit 400,000 on Spaceship Two, but I'm not sure where that's going to go yet. But yeah, we're up in the same ballpark. But I mean, think about the, a regular airliner, you're flying at 30,000 feet. So yeah, when you're getting up, 10 times that high, you're getting pretty far up there, yes.
Whole different reentry, though.
Oh yes, absolutely different reentry. Absolutely. Yeah, the reentry of the X-15, of course, it counted on you saw the reentry heating and all that, and it would really glow cherry red. It was the standard type of reentry that you would expect from things like the space shuttle and what have you. Whereas, of course, on Spaceship One and Spaceship Two, they use that, what they call the feathercock, where the tail comes up and it just sort of flutters back down, and it cuts it down so they don't have to use the same thermal protection, which is a huge thing, and also is an extremely safe way to re-enter. That was an absolutely innovative thing that nobody had figured out before. And Burt Rutan, I don't know how much you know about him, but he does not have traditional aerospace engineer training, primarily because he always said, I don't want to be hoodwinked into being in this little thing of knowing what I can and cannot do. I just want to go out and figure it out for myself. And he came up with this amazing method of reentry. But I know he was out there, it's like, I beat the X-15 on that day. So that was his big thing, yes.
Yes. You had an illustration where they had some scientific experiments going on.
Yes.
Where what was the success? Were they able to collect any micrometeorites or anything like that?
It turned out they did collect some micrometeorites over several different missions. What it is basically just dust at that point, because the meteorites would come in and break apart, and they would just be the dust grains, and that's what they were trying to get. Hopefully not getting a rock actually through there. That would never do it. And they did collect dust, but they ended up finding out that every single sample that they got was contaminated. They never had the proper sterilization procedures and things like that. So all the dust they collected was just, it unfortunately didn't work out very well.
And with that, I'm going to talk really loudly. I'm going to talk really loudly and invite you to join Michelle. Thank you. I thought I was knocking it off. I'm pretty klutzy. Michelle out in the lobby on the mezzanine, and pick up your very own signed copy of The Flight of the X-15. Thank you so much. And before you leave, we have a lovely parting gift for you. Thank you very much. The lessons learned and your enthusiasm for the program is infectious.
Thank you all for having me here.
Thank you all.